My name's Paul. Following a very serious motorcycle incident, I spent a bit of time on life support, and on road to recovery I thought I'd try to do something constructive with my life and make a nature reserve open for disabled people to visit. A special disabled neurological rehabilitation facility, a peaceful place, tranquil, where you might study nature outside your window. I'm just watching a bird. It's just arrived. I think it's a sparrow. Because I feed wild birds, I often see woodpecker and various small birds, doves, finches, tits. Woodpecker comes, that's nice to see. I was just studying Prince Charles, who was doing a speech, Richard Dimbleby lecture. I found it very interesting. I wrote a letter once to him asking him if he knew where I could acquire a piece of land legally. I didn't get much help, but he said I was doing a good job and I should keep on trying.
But we do so because we hang on to values and a perception of things that are developed before we realize the consequences of our actions. Back in the 1950s and right up to the 1990s, it seemed credible to argue that the human will was the master of creation, that the only acceptable way of thinking was a mechanistic way of thinking, that the Earth's natural resources were just that, resources, to be plundered because they were there for our use without limit. It was on such terms that we founded our present age of convenience, a way of living that is now spreading around the world. But for all its achievements, our consumerist society comes at an enormous cost to the Earth, and we must face up to the fact that the Earth cannot afford to support it. Just as our banking sector is struggling with its debts and paradoxically also facing calls for a return to so-called old-fashioned traditional banking, so nature's life support systems are failing to cope with the debts we have built up there too. So if we don't face up to this, then nature, the biggest bank of all, could go bust, and no amount of quantitative easing will revive it. We know, for example, that already the thickness of the Arctic sea ice is reduced by 40% in the last 50 years. The major ice caps on Greenland and Antarctica could soon begin a rapid melt as well. And this may cause sea levels to rise, thereby swamping some of the world's most heavily populated regions, instigating mass migrations. We also know that global warming is thawing permafrosted ground where the release of methane, a very potent greenhouse gas indeed, has already gone up by 70% in the last half century. Since the 1950s, we've also reduced the size of the world's rainforest by a third, and we continue to do so at the rate of an area the size of a football pitch every 4 seconds.
Astounding.
And as the trees fall, we irretrievably lose species of plants and animals that may well prove essential to our survival. Hugging the equator, these rainforests are literally the planet's lifebelt. The Amazonian forests alone release 20 billion tons of water vapor into the air every day. This keeps the climate cool and makes rain that falls over vast areas of farmland. The trees also store colossal amounts of carbon, so their destruction releases yet more CO2 into the atmosphere, more than the entire global transport sector. So we depend upon them for our water, our food, and the stability of our climate. The myriad invisible functions performed by these threatened ecosystems, operating in all their harmonious complexity, are a central element in the Earth's life support system. And yet, we ignore the fact that without them, we cannot survive, both physically and spiritually, for with the rampant removal of biodiversity in all its forms, we also destroy the reflection of nature's miraculous balance within ourselves. We show the same scant regard for the thin and fragile layer of topsoil that grows most of our food. A recent UN report presented the very gloomy news that in just the last 50 years, our heavily industrialized, chemically based farming techniques have so far managed to degrade, to different degrees, a third of the world's agricultural soil. I could go on, but wherever you care to look, our industrial economic model is operating on the same damaging, diminishing return. Our current model of progress was not designed, of course, to create all this destruction. It made good sense to the politicians and economists who set it in train because the whole point was to improve the well-being of as many people as possible. However, given the overwhelming evidence from so many quarters, we have to ask ourselves if it any longer makes sense, or whether it is actually fit for purpose under the circumstances in which we now find ourselves. It seems to me a self-evident truth that we cannot have any form of capitalism without capital. But we must remember that the ultimate source of all economic capital is nature's capital. The true wealth of all nations comes from clean rivers, healthy soil, and most importantly of all, a rich biodiversity of life. Our ability to adapt to the effects of climate change, and then perhaps even to reduce those effects, depends upon us adapting our pursuit of unlimited economic growth to that of sustainable economic growth. And that depends upon basing our approach on the fundamental resilience of our ecosystems. Ecosystem resilience leads to economic resilience. If we carry on destroying our marine and forest ecosystems as we are doing, then we will rob them of their natural resilience and so end up destroying our own. That is why it seems to me of such profound importance that we understand that we are not what we think we are. We are not the masters of creation. No matter how sophisticated our technology has become, the simple fact is that we are not separate from nature. Like everything else, we are nature. The more you understand this fact, the more you see how our mechanistic way of thinking causes such confusion. The way we so often go about meeting people's needs invariably involves us seeking a solution to one problem without thinking of the impact this will have on the whole or the wider context of the situation. Rather in the way that they tried to grow Brazil nuts in plantations some years ago. The entire crop in Peru, for instance, and Bolivia, comes from within the natural forest, which makes it a difficult and labor-intensive process. To try to ease the problem, it was decided to establish Brazil nut plantations, but not one tree produced a single nut. And this is because, as it happens, Brazil nut trees rely entirely on a tiny forest-dwelling wasp for their pollination. So, no forest, no wasp, no nuts. And if you think about it, this is the approach that is invariably taken in all aspects of our existence. Modern agri-industry, for instance, may have made enormous strides to feed the burgeoning world's population, but at a huge and unsustainable cost to ecosystems, through massive use of artificial fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and water. As an example, we put plenty of nitrogen on the fields to make the crops grow quickly, but nitrogen being nitrogen, it makes the weeds grow too, so out come all the herbicides. When it drains into the streams, the nitrogen also makes the algae bloom, which sucks all the oxygen out of the water, suffocating many of the other forms of life in a vital food chain, to the extent that a recent UN survey identified 400 so-called dead zones which have now occurred around the world, where polluted rivers meet the sea and nothing grows at all.